Cardinal News is telling the little-known stories of Virginia's role in our country's march to independence. As we head toward America's 250th anniversary, we'll examine the events, people, and places that shaped the Commonwealth and the nation. Together we can better understand the role of our ancestors beyond what's in the history books. This is Cardinal 250, made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission.
Hello and welcome to Cardinal News 250. I'm Dutchie Jesse. Today we're going to be talking with Tom Vaughan. He is the treasurer of the Overmountain Victory Trail Association in Bristol, Tennessee, and has studied the life of William Campbell for years. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, who is William Campbell? I've never heard of that particular revolutionary figure. We're going to talk about that with Tom Vaughan and find out why we haven't really heard of him and why we maybe should have heard of him at this point. So, Tom, welcome to Cardinal News 250.
Thank you, I think.
This is going to be fun. It's fun to talk about history. You know, we all went through school, presumably, and whether it was private or public or homeschool or whatever, there's certain truths and people that we always sort of hear about when we're talking revolutionary history. And what Cardinal News 250 tries to do is shine a light on some lesser-known figures, groups of people, individual people we don't get to hear about as much as, say, the Founding Fathers. So that's what this is all about today. It's all about the battle at Kings Mountain, the Overmountain Men, which we'll explain who that is, and William Campbell in particular. So let's talk about, first of all, who you are, what it is you do. What is the Overmountain Victory Trail Association? Let's start there.
The Overmountain Victory Trail Association is the chartered partner for the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail, one of 32 national and historic trails throughout the country under the National Park Service. The northern trailhead is in Abingdon, Virginia, at the muster grounds, where Campbell mustered his troops in 1780. I have known about the Overmountain Men my entire life, since one of their routes runs right through our family farm, where we have lived for well over 200 years. But I didn't get interested in history, I'll say, until after I retired. And I wanted to do our annual march once. Well, 12 years later, we will be starting our next annual march September 24th at the Abingdon Muster Grounds with a muster, and we will leave as Campbell did, but not on our horses. They're a little bit tough to haul around in trailers from point to point now.
Mm-hmm. So you grew up down in that region then, Abingdon area?
It's right on the Virginia-Tennessee border, near South Holston Lake, where a few people will know where that's located. But it's in the country, about halfway between Abingdon and Bristol.
So you heard about William Campbell then in childhood?
Oh, yes.
So who is he?
William Campbell was a very interesting person. I'm firmly convinced that if he hadn't died early at the age of 36, that he would have been at least the governor of Virginia, if not president. He was born in central Virginia, I'll say, Orange County area, remembering the counties at that time were not the same counties we know today. He was educated, highly educated, went to what we would consider college, and moved to the frontier, because in 1780, this area was the frontier, Southwest Virginia. And he was commander, started out as a captain of militia in Lord Dunsmore's war. But by 1775, he had signed what were called the Fincastle Resolution or Fincastle Resolves, which really started we don't want to be under England anymore. So somewhere between 1773, 1774, it changed considerably for his fortunes. He married the sister of Patrick Henry. He served in the Virginia legislature. He knew people like Lafayette and Jefferson, and had quite a reputation after the Battle of Kings Mountain. And that's why I say he would very likely have become governor at some point. He had the political connections, the wealth, and he had the fame, as did two of his compatriots, John Sevier, who became the governor of Tennessee, and Isaac Shelby, who became the governor of Kentucky.
So, William Campbell, Augusta County native, is that right?
Correct.
Yes, and I'm getting that. I want to give a shout out to Carolyn Wilson, who contributed this particular article for our Cardinal News 250 series. So read the article on cardinalnews.org. And thanks, Carolyn, for all the information. She described him as a farmer, pioneer, and soldier. He was, as you said, he was well-connected and sort of well-known, a big guy, right?
He was probably over 6'2". His countenance was defined as fair, but not ruddy. And he had brown hair with a reddish tint to it, and would have passed very nicely for a Scots. And guess where both his mother and father's families originated from?
Yeah.
And here on the frontier, being 6 foot, 6'2" was not unusual.
Okay.
As compared to the East Coast, where the settlers here had access to better nutrition than a lot of the settled communities along the coast, where people tended to be a bit shorter.
So let's set up then the battle at Kings Mountain, October 7th, 1780. That's in South Carolina. What can you tell us about that? Kind of set the stage.
William Campbell was brought into the action, if you will, more as a reluctant participant, because his orders were to protect the frontier and protect the lead mines in Wytheville, Virginia, which was actually the headquarters, or I'll say Austinville now. And the lead mines were where the Fincastle Commission was originated. The lead mines were supplying Washington's army with lead. It was the only significant lead mine known in the colonies at that time. He disobeyed his orders because Shelby, after several letters to Campbell, made a trip and a personal plea to him that essentially stated that if we go on this mission and lose, you have not enough men to resist Cornwallis. So William Campbell took that under consideration and sent 200 of his militia. And later, his brother-in-law, Arthur Campbell, also sent 200. So there were 400 Virginians from the brothers-in-law, William and Arthur, that mustered. The reason for that, Patrick Ferguson, one of the majors under Cornwallis, was to recruit people along the Piedmont area in the Carolinas to fight for the king. And Ferguson was an excellent recruiter. He recruited over 3,000 men to fight for the king. Now, it didn't hurt that in May 1780, we had lost an entire Continental Army at Charlestown when General Lincoln surrendered. somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 men. And then in August 1780, our last Continental Army in the South was defeated at Camden under Horatio Gates. There was no more organized resistance left in the South. There was one day from a diary of Usel Johnson at Gilberttown in North Carolina that over 500 men, and women too, came to take protection of the king in one day. That was in August, end of August, early September, after we had lost two entire Continental armies. And people knew, quote unquote, who was going to win. Patrick Ferguson did not like us on this side of the mountain, in our valleys here and in our farms. And our farms were our wealth, land. He sent a threat across the mountain that unless we, the inhabitants of this land, laid down our arms and took protection of the king, he was going to march his army over those mountains and lay waste our lands with fire and sword and hang our leaders. Now, we knew that he had been within about 2 to 3 days' ride at the base of the mountains. So he was well within reach of our farms here. They convinced Campbell, as I said, that he could not resist Cornwallis alone. So they had a grand muster at Sycamore Shoals on September 25th, 1780. Grand muster, McDowell from Quaker Meadows, what's now Morganton, was on this side of the mountain recovering from a battle with Ferguson with about 160 men. Sevier brought 240. Shelby from Sapling Grove, now Bristol, brought another 240. And the Campbell brothers sent 400. They put together probably the largest gathering of humanity that this side of the mountain had ever seen anywhere. 1,000 men, over 1,000 men, 1,000 horses, and many of their families at Sycamore Shoals. They set out. Now, it was interesting. At that time, the commanders were essentially elected by their men. And we had a lot of colonels. A lot of colonels. They went across the mountains, made it to Morganton, and Colonel Cleveland from the Surrey County, Wilkes-Surrey area, brought in another 400 men. And Ms. McDowell sent her people out to the mountains, brought in cattle to feed 1,400 hungry men, because there were no McDonald's on the way to stop and pick up a hamburger.
That's right.
They had a council under Council Oak, which unfortunately is no longer standing on the McDowell plantation, and they decided what they would do. They would rotate commanders, commander of the day. And you can imagine how well that would work if you have 10 or 11 different colonels, each one with their own ideas each different day. They left Quaker Meadows on October the 1st and made it one day's ride until what we believe was a Category 5 hurricane came and squatted on the Carolinas for days.
So can you tell us why we believe that was a Category 5? What do we have?
Yes.
What's the information?
Based on the records of the Spanish forts in Florida and Georgia, and the Spanish kept excellent records.
Okay.
So when you look back and you start stitching all of these pieces together, do we know absolute that it was a Category 4 or 5 hurricane? No. But when we look at the Spanish records along the coast where they did keep such records, it leads us very strong probability that was what was happening. We know that it poured down rain incessantly that whole trip. They hunkered down and they started talking, decided they had to have a commander. The most senior commander at the time was Colonel McDowell, but he was known to be somewhat of, I'll say, not the most aggressive warrior.
Okay.
So they convinced him that they needed a general officer, and the closest general officer to be had was at Hillsborough. So Colonel McDowell set off to Hillsborough. Then Colonel Shelby, who was the youngest of all of the colonels and had convinced Campbell to come on this mission, did, I'll say, just a little bit of lobbying. He convinced all of the other colonels to appoint Campbell as the overall commander of the mission because, one, he had come the furthest from Southwest Virginia, and two, he had brought the most men. But the underlying reason that Shelby did not state, Campbell was not from the Carolinas, and none of the other Carolina colonels would serve under another Carolina colonel. So shall I say there was just a little bit of subterfuge on Shelby's part?
Yeah. So Campbell is then pronounced elected, to lead this group, right?
Yes, he is.
We get out from the hurricane, from the torrential rain for days and days. And how does this culminate?
We missed Ferguson at Gilberttown near Rutherford, North Carolina. Did not know where he had gone because all of the tracks were washed away. Thought that he may have headed toward Fort 96 in South Carolina. Made it to Alexander's Ford on the Green River, almost at the South Carolina border, when Colonel Lacey out of South Carolina rode into the camp and said he had captured one of Ferguson's messengers and that he was on the road headed toward Charlottetown, slowly toward Cornwallis's lines. So at dark 30 on October the 6th, they saddled up as many men as could ride fast, rode almost 30 miles to a place called Cowpens, which was owned by a Tory loyalist. He was happy to feed them all of the cattle they wished to eat that night, since they all had rifles. At 9 o'clock that night, they climbed on their horses in a driving rainstorm and set out. Now, we firmly believe that Ferguson had his spies out and that the walkers and slow movers from Alexander's Ford got there about the time the militia left at 9 o'clock at night and kept the campfires burning all night. Ferguson just knew that the militia hunkered down in the rain like they did a few days earlier. Well, he hadn't expected them to ride all night, 28 miles in a driving rainstorm, and they had almost surrounded the mountain. They made their plans. Campbell would take here, Shelby, Sevier, McDowell, Hampton, Cleveland, and others were assigned their places around the mountain. The first shot was fired at 3 o'clock by one of the sentries. An hour and 5 minutes later, the course of the American Revolutionary War had completely changed.
It was a turning point, was it not?
It was the turning point. We've had that discussion with some of our northern brethren who claim that Saratoga was the turning point. The reason we say Kings Mountain was the turning point. Saratoga was a very important turning point early in the war. Before Kings Mountain, the American forces hadn't had a significant victory in quite some time, and both the American and British forces were maneuvering in the Northeast at each other, but not engaging in battle, because neither was strong enough to know they could take out the other. Cornwallis, the British commander in the South, lost about 25% of his army. But more importantly, Ferguson and his ability to recruit, he lost ability to recruit anymore, because all of a sudden it's, wait a minute, maybe these British aren't going to win this. Maybe we need to rethink this. And it re-energized the war in the South.
Yeah, and that morale is so key, right?
Yes, absolutely was. And it gave, battle at Kings Mountain drove Cornwallis out of the back country to recuperate, and it gave Washington time to appoint Nathaniel Greene, who was an absolutely brilliant commander, to come south, form an army, annoy Cornwallis, and don't lose the army because there is not another one. And he did. Greene lost about every battle he was in, but won the war in the South, drove Cornwallis out. Now, Campbell gave us some of the best history that we have of Kings Mountain. And it gets into politics, which I'm sure that nobody has ever heard of politics, and jealousy.
Right.
Jealousy of a sword. Shelby, who was instrumental in getting Campbell appointed the head commander of this force, and praised him in a letter for his valor after that. Campbell died in 1781 on the way to Yorktown. Didn't make it there. But in 1810, Shelby and Sevier started writing letters back and forth that they had, for politics, because Shelby was in a race to be governor of Kentucky, and he wanted to buff up his credentials. People were accusing him he was only a lieutenant at Kings Mountain. He wasn't there at Kings Mountain, etc. Those letters became public in about 1820, published by one of Sevier's sons. And that's when the fuss fight really started. Because all of a sudden, Campbell's family said he was a hero, as did Virginia, as did Jefferson, as did everybody else. And as Shelby had said earlier, Shelby even wrote a pamphlet talking about how Campbell was a coward at the battle, was not at the top of the battle, was hanging back. Campbell's forces took the majority, significant portion, I'll say, of the casualties at Kings Mountain. They were driven off the mountain twice at the point of bayonets and took a lot of bayonet injuries. We believe that the Patriots had more casualties due to bayonets than bullets. And something like 20,000 shots were fired in an hour and 5 minutes at Kings Mountain. The British forces were running out of ammunition, and we know how many rounds were issued typically to each one. Turns out that Campbell was off his horse. His horse had been shot out from under him, and he was on foot. As a big man, he had shed his jacket, and he had his family's broadsword, his Andro Ferrara, that was made by either a French or an Italian swordsmith, Andre de Ferrara. And he was quite prominent with it. But what people mistakenly saw was John Brodie, Campbell's manservant, slave, who went with him everywhere, was, according to records, bore a striking resemblance to Campbell, was mounted on Campbell's spare horse, and was in Campbell's old clothing. And he was back at the edge of the battle. People saw him. And that is several hundred years worth of head scratching before that was finally determined as probably what happened.
Right. So that this pamphlet that, was it Shelby that put it out?
Yes, Shelby
really
put it out.
Maligning Campbell. Right? And so now we know the origin of that. Just really mistaken identity, that simple?
That's simple.
Yeah.
That's simple. But Campbell was a ferocious fighter. And both sides, both Sevier and Shelby and Campbell, went to living Kings Mountain veterans and took depositions. So we have little slices of personal. This person saw this piece of the battle. This person saw this piece, etc. So we have a body of work, depositions, first person from people who were actually there. Unfortunately, 45 years after the battle, so memories do get a bit dim.
Sure.
But when you stitch everything together, it becomes quite a story, particularly then with the diaries of the British officers that survived and of the letters from the commanders, Shelby, Sevier, etc., that were written in the couple of days right after the Battle of Kings Mountain. So Campbell became the hero, if you will, of the Virginia house, and was later the house awarded his grandson a sword, the finest sword that could be procured, 1,500 crowns to procure that sword. And I have tried to decipher English coinage during that era. So it takes somebody a lot smarter than I am. The best I could come up with for 1,500 crowns was somewhere between 3 and 7 years of wages for a laborer, depending on how skilled the laborer was.
Wow.
So,
yeah, that's impressive.
as I said, I may be off on that, but that is the best I could decipher, because the British crown, the original one was kind of pegged at 4 to a pound sterling, but then they started making the crown out of silver and copper, and the composition changed over time, so the value of the crown changed depending on the date that it was manufactured, etc.
Very, very interesting. Do we know how William Campbell died? He died at age 36. Do we know how?
He was under Lafayette, probably headed toward Yorktown. The statement is that he had a discomfort in his breast, which probably means he was having a heart attack.
Yeah.
His father, Charles, also died at a relatively young age. So it sounds like that would have not been uncommon in the Campbell family for heart problems.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. So before we wrap up, Tom, you are a person who you're sort of an actor of living. Well, you bring history to life with your organization that you're in, but you also, we were mentioning this before we went on, visiting schools, doing various reenactments, and then just basically telling the story. You told me you weren't that interested in history until retirement. What is it about these stories or about our history in general that you think is just so worth telling, especially to the next generation? Tell me about that from your point of view.
I'll start back from kind of even earlier than that. History books tend to be rather dry and dull. Here's this date, and this is what happened on this date, with absolutely no context and nothing of interest to back it up. It is a piece to memorize. Where it really gets interesting is just what I did. When you start picking up that corner and looking under it and you say, ooh, look at this.
Gets juicy.
Ooh, look at this. Just like you asked the question, how did we know that it was a hurricane? Pick up the corners and look.
Right.
I have done a program for an honors English class, high school English class, and I can get people to ask questions. Don't care whether they give me answers right or wrong. We'll get to the same place. I could not get that class to ask a question. It was difficult to get them to respond to anything. And I talked to the teacher later, and I said, why? And she said, that's just how this class is. And it happened to be on a book that I had read that we were talking about Kings Mountain. And in it, one of the things was Patrick Ferguson, a major or a colonel. Some historians call him a colonel. Some call him a major. He was acting as a major at Kings Mountain. British Parliament had awarded him his rank of colonel. It had been transmitted to his commander, Cornwallis, 30 miles away in Charlottetown, Charlotte. Did he have it in hand? Had it been bestowed upon him yet? No. But was he a colonel in the view of the British Parliament? Yes. I said, they've got to pick up the corner and look under there and see why did this happen? Turns out there was a lot of jealousy because the English and Scots, as you may be aware, had a rather long history of not very friendly relations. And I have asked, we had a Scottish exchange student that lived with us for 2 years. Unfortunately, she didn't know a whole lot of their history. Her dad did.
Yeah.
I said, why on earth were the Scots fighting for the British? Answer, land.
Yeah.
To be taken from those rascally rebels.
So it all, what I find so interesting, Tom, is it really all boils down to people. I mean, people back then, it's the same. You talked about it got political later, and each one claiming this about their military service, about their record, and then, well, he wasn't really there, and all the things. I'm like, all that happens today. Despite all the progress and the technological advancements of our world, and it is a different world in many ways, but the human condition remains, the same. Well, I'm really grateful for your taking the time to sit down with us on the Cardinal News 250 podcast, and you keep doing what you're doing, spreading the word and keeping history alive.
If I may do one last one.
Sure.
And this is a quote that I'm actually going to read.
All right.
War is brutal. There is nothing pretty about it. There is a perhaps apoplectical saying sometimes attributed to Winston Churchill and sometimes to George Orwell, to the effect that we sleep safely in our beds because rough men stand ready to go into the night and unleash violence on those who would do us harm. William Campbell was such a man.
Wow.
And I have used that quote before in Veterans Day programs that I've done.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tom, and good luck to you, and keep on keeping on down there in the far southwestern part of Virginia. We're right at the Tennessee line.
And come join.
Yes, I think so.
We do this for about 15,000 students a year.
Yeah, and you're part of the Virginia 250 Commission. You've been involved with that organization, which is who is helping us at Cardinal News with our Cardinal 250 series. So
wonderful.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thanks to Tom Vaughan. That was Tom, treasurer of the Overmountain Victory Trail Association in Bristol. And I also want to thank Carolyn Wilson, who wrote this article for the Cardinal News 250 project. For more articles and more history, more events, go to cardinalnews.org. Our coverage and podcasts are made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission and with help from our friends at Blue Ridge PBS. I'm Dutchie Jesse for Cardinal News.
Thanks for listening to Cardinal 250, made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission. For more information on Cardinal News 250, including the Cardinal 250 and other newsletters, visit cardinalnews.org.